Hi. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for the introduction, Ellie. But first, we want to acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and our relatives' relations, past, present, and emerging.
We're really excited to share our research with you on protest cultures in South Korea. Before beginning, we wanted to express our really deep thanks to the Kyopo team. We especially want to thank Ellie for being the mastermind behind this event and for being such a passionate and enthusiastic partner, and in many ways in helping us imagine a different way to present and share our research. And so this whole production was really a collaboration, and it's actually really exciting to see what it looks like tonight. You all look amazing. It's really cool to see you lit up as well. We also want to thank Kat Yang, Jennifer Moon, Kavier Moon, Youngsun Min, Eileen, and the other wonderful Kyopo members who listened to actually many of our zany ideas when we brainstormed what tonight might look like, and helped support getting ready for tonight. Thanks to Human Resources for hosting, and the work of so many people that made tonight possible, including Antoine, who's doing the sound mixing. He's behind the screen. I don't know if, yeah, he's waving. And I also wanted to thank the artist who's exhibiting their work tonight, Chirag Bhakta. Why You So Negative is here until the 28th, and there's these really awesome newsletters with various articles talking about this exhibit. So if you have time as well, take a look around, but just know that there's installations around the room, so just be aware of that. Okay. So just a little about myself before we start, and then the right one. Yeah, this is okay, great. So as Ali mentioned, I'm a labor sociologist who teaches and writes about the interconnected worlds of gender, race, migration, and labor organizing. I actually came to study labor somewhat unexpectedly after I became involved in community organizing, and particularly Chinese and Korean immigrant factory workers really trying to organize against sweatshop labor abuse in Oakland and San Jose. I had this research stint in a high-tech factory, which actually unexpectedly led me to the contentious streets of Seoul, where I've spent the last 2 decades already studying how precarious workers who are really employed at the bottom rungs of the labor market try to make sense of and seek to transform the kind of capitalist injustice that manifests in their everyday lives and communities.
And I'm a cultural geographer, and I work on gender and sexuality, religion, and mobilities. And I've actually been involved in building anti-racist, feminist, queer and trans spaces in South Korea and the Korean diaspora, also since the 90s, since I was an undergraduate college student. And in a roundabout way, it was that activist trajectory that actually took me to studying conservative and right-wing politics in religious formations, including, as you can see, the Protestant-led opposition to not only LGBT equality, but also against reproductive justice, against the dignity of disabled and poor people, and against progressive social change in Korea and the Korean diaspora. And as many of you might know, a recent example of this includes the local case of the mass-scale rallies in Koreatown against homeless shelters and the recognition of Little Bangladesh. Just a brief explanation of some of the audio and video that we're going to use. This whole 3-screen thing was really, I don't know. I'm still having doubts about this, how it's going to work. But during this presentation, you'll see lots of photos and videos on all 3 screens. Some videos will play without sound. So don't worry, it's meant to be that way. If the photos are too much, you can try to ignore them and maybe focus on just the main screen in the middle.
So our research interests in public religion.
Sorry.
and protest practices converged unexpectedly. Right around the mid-2000s, and we actually never thought they would, because I would often be going to these sort of mass union rallies, and then Judy would be taking the buses to the conservative megachurches. I had actually finished the research for my first book on the turn to symbolic forms of labor organizing among low-paid precarious workers, and I was still closely following what was happening in Korea. Precarious work, which really refers to insecure and often highly unregulated forms of part-time, temporary, and contracted employment that leaves workers actually really vulnerable to the kind of profit-driven practices of their employers, seemed to be a relatively new phenomena when I was studying it in the late 90s and early 2000s. But in just a few short years, it had really become the new normal. And it had ignited, I think, really explosive forms of protest by a lot of new kinds of actors. And what you see to your right are predominantly young women, highly educated, who were hired under various types of masked and disguised contracting, who were the first train attendants on the KTX bullet train. As Judy and I both continued to go back to Seoul for routine research trips between 2005 and 2015, we began noticing a striking pattern, bringing our topics of research closer together. Right? As workers' struggles started to drag on longer and longer, they also started to become more ritualized, toggling between more conventional street marches and mass rallies to more spiritually influenced protests, such as hunger strikes, one-person protests, shaving head mass protests, protest camps, and even self-immolation. These protest forms really seem to stretch our sense of time and space, collapsing the distinctions between the past and present, and rescaling the space of protest from really geographic spread to verticality.
That worked. We want to highlight just 3 variations of these protests: high-altitude occupations, Buddhist prostrations, and religious worship services on the street. So, 고공농성, high-altitude occupations, are in a way a variation of protesters occupying corporate offices, factories, and other buildings to demand a meeting, an apology, or reinstatement. Protesters, who are often workers, climb structures like construction cranes, bridges, billboards, smokestacks, and transmission towers where they can't be easily dragged out or forced out by the police. This is considered one of the most dangerous forms of protest, especially when they last a long time. High-altitude protesters sometimes engage in hunger strikes at the same time. Living in isolation, these are 2 women who actually lived on top of a church bell tower for 203 days. Living in isolation, usually without electricity or running water, and fighting extreme weather conditions. And if you know Korea, you know about 4 seasons. We're talking about monsoon season, the snow, the summer, winter, everything. But more than the weather, they live on the edge of death, afraid of taking just one wrong step. As you can see, how narrow the rooftop often is. And for weeks and even months, the protesters physically dramatize risk and precarity and the frailty of the human body, and also their willful refusal to succumb. Importantly, they call for the solidarity of supporters on the ground below, without whom they could not survive. So the supporters on the ground not only feed the protesters up above by sending food and that sort of thing, also helping take care of waste in buckets and whatnot. And these days also charging their phones, charging their electronic devices by sending batteries, portable batteries up and down. That's also a really big part of the support. Incidentally, though, the very first high altitude occupation, it's on the right side, left side. was actually in, yep, there we go, Gangjuryong. The very first high-altitude occupation is credited to a woman worker named Kang Ju-ryong, who in 1931 climbed on the rooftop of a rubber factory. So this is during the Japanese colonial period in Pyongyang to protest against pay cuts and layoffs. So this whole high-altitude protests, a lot of people actually trace it historically to a woman worker. Samboilbae, which is the photo that actually just passed, which literally means 3 steps and 1 bow. This first became well known in 2003 when an interfaith delegation led by a Buddhist monk embarked on a 300-kilometer, 65-day-long Samboilbae procession to oppose the destruction of Saemangum wetlands in Korea, as well as the US war in Iraq. So this was 65 days of doing Samboilbae procession over 300 kilometers. Korean farmers then used this ritual procession to make a huge impression, especially in the international media in Hong Kong in 2005, by showing that Korean anti-WTO delegates and Korean protesters in general were not violent, unlawful protesters as they had been depicted by the mainstream media in Hong Kong at the time. Samboilbae turns an ordinary march into a dramatic, physically demanding procession. And as if that were not enough, there is now uchetuji, which is physically even more difficult. Uchetuji literally means throwing 5 points of the body onto the ground. So that's your forehead, your 2 elbows, and 2 knees, in a manner similar to crawling on one's belly. Uchetuji creates not only a religiously inflected spectacle of discipline and devotion, but also foster public empathy for the protesters suffering as they engage in painstakingly slow and grueling motion, often across busy, congested, and polluted urban streets. The third protest form we want to highlight is 종교 집회, a variety of religious worship services that take place usually outdoors, on the street, at the site of long-term protest camps, and in key urban areas, locations. They often follow the same Buddhist, Protestant, or Catholic liturgical practices as indoor services, with attendees citing familiar prayers, singing hymns, and receiving holy sacraments as if they were inside the walls of a church or a temple. These religious worship services constitute a mass assembly that offers a very different routine from the secular protest chants, movement songs, and political speeches. And they often create a more somber space of reflection and communion. And they're usually often in solidarity with protesters engaged in long-term struggle. They also help mourn for the loss of loved ones, including family and comrades lost to suicide and other political deaths.
These are just a few of the many dramatic protest forms that have become a familiar part of South Korea's contemporary protest repertoire. And this is not only among striking workers, but also among anti-eviction protesters, disability rights activists, bereaved families, and many others. Some scholars, and many workers themselves in their own words, have described these protests as desperate. A tactic of last resort, as striking workers become dragged into battles with employers in the courts and on the streets for months and sometimes years at a time. So for example, Kiryung unionists that are shown in the Oche Tuji video that you saw earlier initially thought that their strike would last just 3 days during an interview. Then, after nearly exhausting the protest repertoire, including one of the union leaders engaging in a 67-day hunger strike, they thought it would be that it was again over, and this was after 1,895 days, which at the time was unprecedented. But then, when workers showed up to work after the court ruling that the company must rehire them, they showed up and everything was gone. The company had packed up the entire contents of the factory, which manufactured parts for Sirius satellite radios, and simply left without telling them. An occurrence that is actually not uncommon, but nonetheless, of course, outrageous. It is no wonder that Kiryung workers describe their exceedingly long struggle, often in very dramatic terms. Quote, "We did everything except die," they would explain to reporters and also during our interview. And of course, the Kiryung case is not the only example. These long-term and protracted struggles, which seem hopeless and bound to failure, raise the question of why anyone would voluntarily choose to engage in such losing battles. So political sociologists often offer an explanation, which is that protest repertoires are essentially culturally ingrained. Right? When a repertoire becomes established and repeated enough times, it becomes less about strategy and more about habit. And so they say protesters commonly resort to a familiar set of tactics, symbols, scripts, and performances to make visible their discontent, rather than try to innovate what's already been done. While we certainly would not deny that protest activities can operate somewhat like an ingrained common sense, we felt like after seeing so many of these protests over years and years, and also being able to see the images from afar, that there was a need to take these protest forms much more seriously as structures of feeling, right? A rich and varied set of aesthetic practices that, quote, operate at the very edge of semantic availability, according to the theorist who coined the concept. In our book project, from which this talk draws upon, we argue that protests are as much about form and feeling as they are about tactics and demands. And so rather than focus solely on what protesters do or fail to do, we wanted to focus on how movements move, both themselves and others. By the word choice move, we refer to the flow of bodies in motion across place and time, as well as the affects and feelings generated when one is moved emotionally.
So we set out to study all these things, all these different protest forms, and moved temporarily to Korea. We went to Korea in 2016, and then this happened. Less than 2 months after we arrived in Seoul, we found ourselves riding the entire wave of the Candlelight Protests. From its start in the fall of 2016 through the bitterly cold winter and suffocating smog in the spring, witnessing the impeachment and resignation of President Park Geun-Hye, and the special election in May 2017 that led to the current liberal administration with President Moon Jae-in. Actually, this one should play video. Yeah. Sorry. These weekly public assemblies were unprecedented in size, but also in duration. Over the 6 months between October 29th, 2016 and April 29th, 2017, Seoul was the site of 20 official candlelight protests. And this is what a lot of people forget about the candlelight protests. That this wasn't just once. They were held on 20 consecutive Saturdays, with 6 of them drawing near 1 million protesters, and 2 of them drawing close to 2 million, if not slightly over, participants in the city center. And the interesting thing about the participants is that some of the Candlelight Protests, no doubt, some of the participants of Candlelight Protests, no doubt relished the space with nostalgia for the bygone days of student activism. But for many others, this was the first protest that they had ever attended. We saw a lot of young mothers and youth, as young as middle school students, taking to the open mic to speak about how they could no longer sit back and do nothing. The familiar protest landscape of organizational flags by unions and NGOs coexisted alongside creative and irreverent flags like Union of Cat Lovers or an association of unaffiliated individuals. There are all kinds of interesting flags that we saw. And mass protests were no longer just about the radicalized or militant unionists willing to sacrifice and suffer for democracy and social justice. They were also for civic-minded public who wanted peaceful, fun, festive, and low-risk spaces to participate in social change. There were candlelight protests, not just in Seoul, but throughout the country. But there's a long tradition of folks traveling to Seoul to protest, since it is, after all, the capital. Some people walk there. We actually live behind the Blue House in the mountains, so going to protest meant climbing down and climbing back up afterwards. Some took the bus or the subway, and some people drove. Stopped at the gate, at the periphery of the city, the tractors.
But it wasn't just all fun and festive really dramatic. In just a moment, although the dramatic moments continued, we're going to play the perfect 5-minute video to give you a sense, actually, of the tremendous affective charge that permeated this entire period, and the feelings of grief, mourning, hope, and empowerment that pulsed throughout the Candlelight Protests. And so, but before we play this video, we wanted to point out a couple things for crucial context. The video begins, I think this is not the right slide, with the people's, I think we have to go back, sorry. The video begins with the people's funeral for Paeng Nam-gi, a 67-year-old farmer and former student activist whose funeral portrait is affixed on top of the pickup truck that you see in this image that was leading the march. In November 2015, Paeng Nam-gi was blasted at close range with a police water cannon at the annual Labor Peasant Urban Poor mass rally that took place every November. He fell into a coma for nearly a year before he died in September 2016. When he passed away, the hospital announced that he died of natural causes, and then the government wanted to conduct an autopsy against his family's wishes, a practice that actually harkens back to the darker days of dictatorship. This, of course, mobilized hundreds of activists and students, and a lot of people from the Catholic progressive pro-democracy movement. They camped out 24/7 for nearly 40 days in the Seoul National University Hospital parking lot to literally protect his body from police capture. Outrage over the circumstances of Paeng Nam-gi's death catapulted a regularly scheduled mass rally that following year into a martyr's funeral, and helped ignite the candlelight vigils into a nationwide mobilization. And I think this is really important because not a lot of people know that before the candlelight protests, there was all this stuff happening before. And of course, Paeng Nam-gi's death and the circumstances afterwards combined with the 2014 capsizing of the Seoul ferry that killed 314 passengers, mostly high school students from a single working class high school in Ansan on a school field trip, the stage was set with necropolitical circumstances, and the air was full of outrage, of grief, and a widespread sense that things must change to create any hope for survival.
So throughout the short video that you're going to see, you'll also see spectacular scenes of a city transformed. And if you think about it, the Candlelight Protests were mega events. They drew from remarkably competent and highly experienced social movement personnel who knew how to set up and take down the huge stages each week. And as it turned out, we learned actually during our interviews that many of them also worked in event production. So people sort of who had experience with setting up K-pop concerts actually came in really handy in preparing for this kind of mass protest. So they're equipped with sophisticated high-tech audiovisual equipment with multiple super jumbo screens, and speakers the size of small buildings that they suspended from construction cranes. Movement activists also created practical maps for public toilets, because that's important, very important, and marching routes, designated areas for medical attention or lost children, and put together programs with artists, singers, performers, and filmmakers who made the protest spaces moving, entertaining, and worth attending. The documentary video clip that we're going to show is a product of this reservoir of social movement know-how, produced by an activist filmmaker for the official organizing committee, which was a national coalition of over 1,500 groups. And it was shown during one of the final Candlelight protests.
대통령직 임기 단축을 포함한 진퇴 문제를 국회의 결정에 맡기겠습니다.
To let me in, shattered windows and the sound of drums. People couldn't believe what I'd become. Revolutionaries wait for my head on a silver plate, just a puppet on a lonely string. Oh, who would ever wanna be king?
주문을 선고합니다. 주문, 피청구인 대통령 박근혜를 파면한다.
밝혀내자! 세월호를 인정하라! That was when I ruled the world.
You can see from the video, this was a really incredible time. And, you know, I can't help but get choked up, no matter how many times I see this video. I don't know if it's Coldplay or the fact that even when you're there, you can't really comprehend the scale of it. And so many people would talk about how they would spend hours and hours, right, trying to really soak in everything about the protests, and then they would go home and watch YouTube video after YouTube video to see what they had missed. Some have come to refer to this as the Candlelight Revolution in South Korea because it did succeed in achieving what had seemed impossible, impeaching and ousting the widely despised right-wing president and throwing her into jail for corruption. We did it, was the jubilant, triumphant sentiment that was repeated over and over again. But there are critical aspects that trouble this triumphant narrative. First, this was not actually the beginning. And I think, of course, we did it was often followed with, this is just the beginning, right? As if the Candlelight Protest really heralded this new and completely revolutionary moment. But as we've already shown you, a vibrant culture of protest has existed long before 2016 and 2017. And there were also mass-scale candle protests that can be traced as early as 2002. And these struggles, many of which occurred simultaneously alongside the Candlelight protests, are still ongoing today. And then, of course, another troubling aspect was this overarching emphasis on unity. And of course, what's wrong with unity? We're not saying something's wrong with unity per se, but in the way that the emphasis on unity amplified certain voices while silencing others. Despite the celebrations for the much-needed regime change, not everyone could embrace this political moment as the beginning of something entirely new and wonderful. So, of course, I study precarious workers, and striking workers seemed incredibly out of place and out of sync with the post-impeachment euphoria. Refusing to be ignored or forgotten, 6 workers, I think they're here, who were part of this coalition of precarious workers that were engaged in long-term struggle. They essentially climbed on top of like a 10-story building that was located on the southwest corner of Gwanghwamun, and basically started waging a joint hunger strike and aerial occupation under a high-voltage LED billboard. It was a Samsung Galaxy billboard above a Godiva store. It's right here. So you see them sort of on the top, and down below is a Godiva store, and of course, in front of the posh Four Seasons Hotel. All they packed, carrying going up to the rooftop, was a sleeping bag, stomach medicine, a blood glucose meter, a plastic trash bag, and their smartphones. Their efforts, however, did not seem to make much of a difference or an impact. And so basically on the 26th day, After receiving little support, although there were a lot of candlelight protesters that visited and did one-day solidarity hunger strikes, this was not enough. And so the workers were carefully aided in their descent, coming down one by one, and then rushed to the hospital in ambulances for emergency medical treatment. Within the mass protest spectacle, feminists also spoke defiantly and without apology against misogyny, sexism, and violence against women, demanding that the candlelight protesters include more women in decision-making and programming, and creating protest spaces without bigotry and hate speech. They designated femi-zones, right, these feminist zones that were to be safe spaces for women within the very, very crowded candlelight protests. And they were constantly questioning the old ways of doing protest, especially if that meant putting feminism on hold while working for social change. Radical feminists, young feminists, would go on to mobilize tens of thousands of young women in a kind of unprecedented mobilization as part of the worldwide Me Too protests movement. And intersectional feminist organizing, side by side with queer and disability rights activists, would go on to decriminalize abortion in early 2019. And I have to give a shout out to Yudim, raise your hand, one of the kick-ass feminist organizers that was really part of this push to decriminalize abortion.
So among the most obvious disappointments concerned LGBT communities. Despite the undeniable gains in visibility and recognition in recent decades, today we see a more clearly articulated and institutionalized backlash against LGBT equality from Christian conservatives, mostly. But also persistent is homophobia and everyday heterosexism among liberal progressives and sometimes even self-identified feminists. This is played out with remarkable consistency as politicians and public figures have regressed or reversed their positions concerning LGBT equality. And Moon Jae-in, as a presidential candidate, set a clear example of this when he said that he was, quote unquote, opposed, of course, to LGBT equality during a televised debate that aired during the Candlelight Protests. This set off a firestorm of angry protests by LGBT groups who denounced his comments and demanded respect and legal protection for LGBT folks, often referred to as sexual minorities or 성소수자 in Korea.
저는요 여성이고 동성애자인데 제 인권을 반으로 자를 수 있습니까? 제 평등선을 반반으로 자를 수 있냔 말입니다. 이게 대선을 보면 대답을 해주시란 말입니다. 왜 이 성평등 정책 안에 여성 동성애자에 대한 성평등을 포함하지 못하시는 겁니까?
죄송한데 저희도 여기가 있거든요. 말씀을 하세요. 어디 있는 분들 목소리 가주세요.
This video was widely shared on social media. I would even describe it as it went viral. But I think it went viral not only because of the moving image of Kwa Gi-kyung, a longtime queer and labor activist, her voice trembling with anger, or the spectacle of this political disruption. I think it was particularly remarkable because, as you can see from Moon's and the audience's response to Kwak's utterance in protest, I will give you a chance to speak later. Moon is heard telling Kwak when she continued to press for his response. But the voices in the audience, the voices from the audience can be heard repeating Moon later, 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 and this catches on, and within moments, the entire audience seems to be chanting in unison, later, later, later. I think this is a chilling scene of a crowd silencing the voice of one, the cheery collective chants of the mainstream, in eerie contrast to the urgency of the protesters. The collective chants of an auditorium full of women, and this was at a feminist event, many of them feminists and leaders of women's organizations, feel positively menacing as they defer LGBT equality to later. The idea of later soon became a key theme in queer politics. It was no surprise that the annual Korea Queer Culture Festival, the annual Pride, adopted right now, not later, as its theme slogan that year in 2017. Several other political campaigns followed this emphasis on the urgency of the now. Stop the witch hunt against gay soldiers, enforce labor rights now, anti-discrimination laws now, raise the minimum wage now, etc. Queer feminist politics remind us to pay attention to the margins, to the silenced voices, to the invisible critics. They urge us to not just be wowed by mass rallies and huge spectacles, but to build solidarity with the most vulnerable minorities. We ask also that you try to notice all the creative interventions and innovative protests that communities in Korea and here in the US are engaged in, and think about the relations that are forged through the diverse protest repertoires.
So our final section, the conclusion. So before walking into this space tonight, many of you have probably heard about and seen the spectacular images from the 2016-17 Candlelight Protests. Some of you might have even been there in person. Certainly, the mass mobilization of millions of people in the historic centers of Seoul was a catalytic moment of eventful history. The Candlelight Protests delivered a huge win for people who have long relied on public protests as a means to exercise some kind of political voice and influence over public policy. It is, of course, essential to celebrate, especially when success is so few and far between. But celebrating the win should not mean oversimplifying what made this historic change possible. Candlelight protests are just one of the many affectively charged forms that protesters are using in South Korea to move publics to challenge the status quo. The Candlelight protests, the mass scale of it, the tremendous production of it, the enduring memories of it, all of this would not have happened without the grief and outrage that brought people out into the streets, and without minoritized social movement groups that mobilize diverse protest forms to build a collective spirit of resistance and solidarity, no matter if they face repeated failure and actually never get to resolve even their own struggle. Mass protests of such scale also could not have taken place, right, without understanding Seoul's impressive urban infrastructure, right? And the amazing competence and capacity of people and civil society groups that are really engaging with the kind of changes that are transforming Seoul as a global city every day. If we had more time, we could go into detail about the many, many remarkable struggles taking place, some of which people in this room are intimately involved, right? And this includes the redress movement for the former, quote-unquote, comfort women, survivors of military sexual slavery by the Japanese Army during the Second World War, who have demanded an official apology every Wednesday at noon for nearly 30 years. And for those of you who might not know, there's actually a Sonyeosang, a comfort women statue in Glendale, and a group, we also have Linda Lee in the room, who's part of a group called Nabi that's really trying to get the word out right here and among a lot of young people. The still ongoing struggle by bereaved parents of the Seoul ferry tragedy, seeking the truth of what happened and the punishment of those responsible. This is also ongoing. We also should pay attention to and we could talk about the transnational flows of protest forms and cultures among protesters on opposing sides of the political spectrum, which is actually wreaking havoc in the centers of Seoul today, but also are occurring right here in Los Angeles. And we can see I think the anti and pro shelter protesters on opposing sides at a metro stop on Wilshire.
And what was actually really particularly striking was that the anti-homeless shelter protests in Koreatown were using the language of the Seoul ferry and saying that we will not forget. So these protest forms are actually sort of, they're crossing ideological lines between, from left to right and right to left. So they're actually becoming sort of a shared protest repertoire. We could go on.
But we won't.
But we do want to conclude. We can't. We want to conclude with a few final points. First, obviously, maybe not so obviously, protests don't just happen. Protest spaces are constantly produced and reproduced by the defiant, but also creative, incredibly creative activity of people who put their bodies and their lives on the line to shed light on inequality and injustice. They challenge the degradation of people's lives and the denial of a viable future for all. And social justice protests refuse to accept the predatory practices of markets, capital, and the state. These protests happen when people refuse to disappear. Protests are also not just about strategies to win or lose. Protest repertoires connect people to one another, and these relationships often outlive the specific goals or demands of a protest event. They cultivate emotionally charged interdependencies and solidarities that continually build capacities and foster new political imaginaries. And the city, I didn't finish the map, so this is all you get. And the city is not just a passive backdrop or a stage for protests. Protests shape the city, and the city shapes protests. Some folks might see Seoul mostly as a place to shop, to eat, or to play. But we could pause and take the time to learn and pay attention to all the ways that so many people have refused to accept the status quo. Then we could perhaps recognize Seoul also as a protesting city, a city that is not only full of violent histories and precarious lives, but also full of people who aspire for a future that is still in the making.
Thank you.